I hope that the screenplay we wrote opened the door to the notion that it was a guy who didn't want to give up living his life the way he wanted to live it, that there was a statement about independence, but there was also a statement about penance and redemption.
Welcome to Deviate with Rolf, where I talk with experts, public figures, and interesting people about fascinating topics that meander off topic. Today's episode is a direct extension of my episode exploring and unpacking the best travel movies of all time. One surprise for me when I was trying to figure out which travel movies I liked best was the fact that I really responded to The Straight Story. And The Straight Story is, as travel movies go, a bit unorthodox.
Rose, darling, I'm going to go back on the road, and I've got to make this trip on my own. I've got to go see Lyle. I know you understand.
Alvin, you're going to get blown off the road. That's what I'm afraid.
Indeed, The Straight Story isn't about a young protagonist setting off to see the world to discover something new. It's about a 73-year-old man riding a lawnmower across the rural Midwest to make peace with his brother. It was directed by David Lynch, who's best known for bizarre and haunting movies like Blue Velvet and Lost Highway and the TV show Twin Peaks. Yet The Straight Story is an understated and humble movie that captured something true about a certain corner of the American Midwest. After talking about The Straight Story in the last episode, I realized that one of its screenwriters, a man named John Roach, was never a Hollywood guy. John is from the Midwest, from Wisconsin, and he still lives there, where he has, over the years, worked as a writer, video producer, and magazine columnist. I tracked him down with some questions about The Straight Story, and I'm glad I did, since our conversation plays out like a lost DVD commentary track that offers a perspective on the movie that even David Lynch, its director, couldn't provide. The movie is based on a true story, and John researched and co-wrote it with Mary Sweeney, a longtime David Lynch collaborator. And together they made a movie that delves into the life of an older protagonist as well as the subtle beauty of the Midwest without seeming sentimental or maudlin in their storytelling. John and I talk about how creative license with what happened in real life deepened the truths at the heart of the story, how The Straight Story is a pilgrimage movie of sorts, and even how deer rutting season affected how the movie was made. Our conversation has a lot of love for the Midwest, and there are no real spoilers here since The Straight Story is written in such a way that there's not much to spoil. Here's John Roach and I talking about how The Straight Story got made and what makes it an extraordinary travel movie. Let's start by talking about the movie itself. We can dig into your involvement with it, which I'm really curious about, but this is not a very normal movie. I mean, it's not really a genre movie. It's sort of a travel movie, and I included it in a roundup of travel movies earlier, but it's not your typical travel movie, in part because it has a 73-year-old protagonist, and then it's also not a very normal David Lynch movie either. It's a G-rated movie that came out 20 years ago. Right. So how would you describe this movie to someone?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is that it's based on a true story. And there was actually, because of that, my co-writer Mary Sweeney and myself, we traveled the route that Alvin Straight traveled on his lawnmower to visit his brother. The trip took over 6 weeks, and we were able to, this was right at the advent of the web becoming a more robust tool. We were able to pull up all sorts of articles, both national articles. The Washington Post, I know, did a piece on him. The Network News did a piece on him. But also there were a lot of pieces from smaller newspapers across Iowa and other states. And we were able to kind of piece together his route. It wasn't really etched in stone, but we interviewed people along the way. So I personally felt that there was a documentary component to telling his story. At least that's what it was at the outset. The qualifier, obviously, is that it wasn't a documentary. It was based on a true story. And as far as it being atypical for David, I know David and got to know him even better, in the couple summers prior to The Straight Story and then working on it. David is a real sweet guy, and this is a sweet story. And I do feel that I did think, and I told him, I said, Dave, you're going to mess with a lot of people with the Straight Story. It's kind of like your Sergeant Pepper's, where it's a big right turn, but great artists always challenge their audiences and they avoid becoming a cliche of themselves. And I thought that it was, you know, kind of courageous for Dave, but not that courageous, because I thought Elephant Man had the same sort of compassion, human feel. And I think that's the Elephant Man is as good a movie as you'll ever find. There was a tremendous amount of soul in the Elephant Man that I think you saw demonstrated by David in the Straight Story as well.
Well, you know, your co-writer, Mary Sweeney, has worked with David Lynch before, but this was a first for you. How did you get involved with the project?
Well, Rolf, I always feel like for 1 year I was called up to the bigs. I worked as a writer, producer, director in broadcast television in the network-owned stations in Chicago, WLS and WBBM, did a lot of live television programming, and then left there and moved back to Madison, Wisconsin to raise our family, and developed a handful of syndicated cable shows and started my own production company. And Mary and I became friends because my last name is Roach and her last name is Sweeney. And so from an alphabetical standpoint, we were seated next to each other in Catholic grade school in Madison and became fast friends. And it was interesting, you know, we were friends through grade school and high school. We just had similar interests. And as it turned out, we both went into related fields. I went into broadcast content and she went into film content. And in 1996 or 7, you know, she gave me a heads up saying, hey, you know, I've been editing and I'd really like a chance to do some writing. Would you like to work on a script with me? And I had kind of put my toe in the water on screenwriting prior and had written some documentaries and did a lot of writing every day in broadcast. And I write a local column, so I fashioned myself as a writer first. And so I jumped at the chance with no notion that we were going to be writing for David. And then shortly thereafter, Mary faxed me I believe it was the Washington Post article about Alvin Straight and she had a big question mark on it with a magic marker. And it's indicative of when this piece was done that she faxed the article to me rather than sending me a link. So we talked on the phone. I said, wow, this is really intriguing. And my brother, who is an audio guy in broadcast, had actually been the audio man on an interview with Alvin Straight that Good Morning America or one of the network morning shows had done. And my brother Jim said, he's a really interesting guy. And he thinks the media is a bunch of BS. So I thought that was intriguing. So I jumped in my car and traveled from Madison to the end point of his trip in Blue River / Mount Zion, Wisconsin. And just driving along those roads was real evocative. I'm a son of the Midwest. I am proud of being a Midwesterner. And the country that Alvin traveled through on his riding lawnmower with a little trailer behind is beautiful to my eye. And I know it was to Mary's as well. That's kind of how I jumped in on it with Mary. And then in short work, shortly thereafter, Mary tried to get the rights from Alvin and the Straight family. And he had already sold the rights to Ray Stark, a big Hollywood producer, Ray Stark, and Larry Gelbart, who produced MASH. So if nothing else, it confirmed our notion that it was a story. And to Mary's credit, who was the producer of the film as well, she checked with Alvin Straight a year after we tried to get the rights. And these two big Hollywood producers had let the rights lapse and Mary jumped in. And so we were able to proceed with, exploring the screenplay. And it entailed leaving Madison, Wisconsin and driving all the way to Lorenz, Iowa, which is in kind of the southwest corner of Iowa. And Iowa is a really pretty big state and pretty flat once you leave the river country. And by that time, Alvin had passed. So we interviewed his family members and then simply got on the road ourselves and tried to track his travel and interviewed people along the way who had encountered Alvin.
I'm curious to know how you put the story together in the course of that research trip, because a trip like this tends to be a little picaresque. You know, it's just this happens and then this happens, and it was based on a real story. Yet, Alvin Straight's journey comes together through these very vivid encounters with various people he meets, including a hitchhiker and some bicyclists and a pair of twins who overcharge him for fixing the mower.
Right.
And so I'm curious to know how, you know, of this grand scope of who you could have included over this 6-week real story journey, you chose these sub-stories and these encounters for the script.
Right. So, you know, Rolf, I'm not, you know, some of the scenes and characters in the film were based upon people we talked to, but it is based on a true story, but it is, you know, more of our interpretation of what that story was. And so there was absolutely some creative license taken with Richard's, with the story that Richard Farnsworth starred in and Alvin's story. And, you know, we've never, you know, I don't, you know, personally want to just say, well, this was kind of came from the writers and this came from what we discovered on the road, because it's such a rich mix that it'd be difficult and unfair to try to pick what was really rooted in something. But I will tell you this, when we sat down to write the screenplay, a lot of it was, you know, rooted in what we experienced along the road. But we found ourselves, because we didn't have Alvin to talk to at this time, he had passed. I would argue the single biggest question that I had and that Mary and I discussed was why? Why did he take this trip? And in, you know, that was the most interesting puzzle to unlock for us. And, you know, I hope that the screenplay we wrote opened the door to the notion that it was a guy who didn't want to give up living his life the way he wanted to live it, that there was a statement about independence, but there was also a statement about penance and redemption. That there was, and in fact, there were some things that had to be ironed out between Alvin and his brother.
It is, in a sense, sort of a pilgrimage story, because
I agree.
This is a guy who had a chance, at least in the movie version, had a chance to hitch a ride after a certain point and get there faster, but it really felt like the journey itself was part of the penance process.
I really do think that. So both Mary and I were educated in Catholic schools. And so I think not consciously, but subliminally, some of the parables that we learned in our youth came out in our interpretation of Alvin's trip. I do think that there were, obviously, Alvin could have asked for a ride. He could have taken a bus, although there was no real easy way to get there. There were no he would have had to transfer 3 times. There were no trains. There was no direct air flights. And also, Rolf, this was, you know, Alvin was a real independent guy. You know, he was part of the rural poor. His family never owned a home. All his children were born in a family bed, not in hospitals. He had, I think, 6 or 7 kids. I personally felt in speaking to him on the phone and then hearing about him from his children that Alvin was part of the vestigial remains of the Dust Bowl population. You know, they're called Okies in the day. And I worked on dairy farms growing up, and there were folks who worked the land in a seasonal basis, and they would come through town and help harvest whatever fruit or crops were to be harvested. And, we lose sight of the rural poor in America. But I think Alvin was part of that population and with roots very deep in that population. I mean, the fact that his family never owned a home is something, that's sharecropper material, frankly. But he also, knowing folks from that culture, they're very self-sufficient. They certainly know how to fix a lawnmower and, make a trailer for it and hook it onto the lawnmower and ride across the state, which is what Alvin did. I just think he was part of a very self-sufficient generation, a part of a generation that grew up in rural, not urban America. And I think it kind of seemed sort of natural to Alvin. It wasn't a big deal to Alvin, I don't think. It was a big deal to a lot of other people, but to Alvin, it was just, well, that's the way I wanted to go.
It's interesting how these days in cinema, we talk a lot about representation and whose stories are being told, but the rural poor is a demographic that stories are not often told in a sympathetic way. And I tell you what, one of the biggest fans of this movie is Alice Potts, my mother, a Kansas farm girl.
Sure.
Who watched it and just in a way that the movie is it sort of gives a beautiful and romanticized vision of the rural Midwest, but it's not sentimental. And so she could identify, I think she's identified with this movie in ways that she didn't identify with other movies. She saw her rural Kansas upbringing in this movie in a way that no other movie has really done so.
Well, Rolf, both Mary and I felt we knew Alvin because our fathers were of that generation. And we referred to our fathers a lot. And there's a term in Wisconsin and rural America, Midwest America, I called Alvin a tough old cob. Okay, I don't know if you've heard that term, but that's a term my dad used to use. My dad sold seeds and worked as a gandy dancer on railroads and stuff, even though he grew up in Madison. But, the era my dad grew up in was still much more rural than urban, in the 30s, Depression 30s, which is when both my mother and father grew up. And, Madison is the capital of Wisconsin, but you cannot help but be affected by the farm culture of Wisconsin when you live in Wisconsin. And I worked on dairy farms for 3 summers during high school to get in shape for high school football. And so I baled hay and milked cows and, got crap on my boots and, learned to love that lifestyle and learn to love the beauty of the natural world that you worked in every day, from dawn till dusk. And so that was really informed my view of everything. And I do think, first of all, bless your mom, but, I do think the story of rural America and rural white America isn't told very much anymore. We are an urban society. And that part of our roots and our culture, even currently, is ignored by popular media and cinema. No question about it.
Yeah, it's a bracing look at a part of the country that doesn't usually get bracing looks. Recently, I was listening to a podcast about Field of Dreams, which is another Iowa story.
Sure,
but it's a very different. Yeah, it's a different take on Iowa. The straight story vision of Iowa is a completely different one than the Field of Dreams vision, even though they're both positive visions, right?
Yeah, I agree. I do think that, the Field of Dreams was more an ode to baseball than rural America, even though it did have that component. But I think one of the things about the straight story that David did so well is he captured Alvin alone in the natural world of the Midwest incredibly well. He let the story breathe. He was, the story is unabashedly slow. And I made the observation when we were doing it. I said, you guys, this is like a Western because Alvin's tractor moved at the pace of a horse, and at the pace of a life of a lifestyle from a different time, you know, where, I mean, Alvin didn't have a phone, didn't have a television. He slept in the fields. And that's how people traveled, in the century preceding the 1900s.
Yeah, it really is maybe generationally specific in who you have as Alvin. I noticed that one, David sort of frames the whole film with views of the stars, and then two, Alvin Straight is depicted as a guy who loves thunderstorms, and those two details, as a Midwesterner myself, the idea that in the Midwest you don't have forests or mountains, but you have the stars, which are so beautiful and so vivid, and then you have these thunderstorms. What decision went into featuring stars and thunderstorms as a big part of Alvin Straight's passions?
Right. Well, first of all, anything that's represented in the film, the script has something to do with it, but it's David's touch that makes it magical. So I just want to preface pretty much anything I say about that. He's just a marvelous artist. And his roots are more rural than urban as well. He grew up in Montana. His father worked for the U.S. Forestry Service. So David knew full well what the natural world of America was like. As far as the stars and the thunderstorms, both Mary and I are big fans of weather. And when you drive slowly, when we traveled Alvin's route, we would go out of our way to drive slowly through the landscapes he drove on the side of the road to get a sense of the pace of the world he lived in. And you can't help but be mindful of the weather. And in the evening, you have two sources of entertainment. You have the campfire and you have the stars and nothing else. Maybe the sounds around you of the animals of the night in cornfields or wooded areas along Alvin's route. And both Mary and I, have, enjoyed the Northwoods of Wisconsin, where the stars are remarkable. You can still see the Milky Way. There isn't light pollution or just, pollutants in the air. We can still see the Milky Way. And so we both, I know I won't speak for Mary, but I know for a fact that I marvel at the stars more than a couple times every year when I'm up north. And we've lost touch with that other part of our landscape. And so we were mindful of that when we wrote the screenplay. And when you're traveling in rural America, you can see the stars awfully well and far better than you can in urban America.
Yeah, there's even sort of a philosophical aspect to that. I'm curious to know a couple of moments of humor in the movie and how they seem also regionally specific. One is there's a whole scene dedicated to the acquisition of a grabber, and two, there's a couple of references to Wisconsin as a party state. Those both feel very specifically observed. So how did those moments come about?
Well, the grabber scene, Alvin was infirm. And so the grabber was kind of put in there. I'm not sure if he had a grabber with him or not. He might have. But we were familiar with that tool because of our older relatives. And the hardware store, I think we were both mindful of the fact that there are certain places in towns in rural America where the locals hang out. The taverns aren't open in the morning, There's a diner sometimes, but sometimes the old guys hang around in either an auto shop or a hardware store. Okay. And so we picked up a hardware store, and then the scene has Alvin, looking for a grabber, and the only grabber remaining was the hardware store owner's grabber, which he used to get items off the tops of the shelves. And so Alvin offered to buy it from him. And then the locals who, had heard that, Alvin was considering something a little strange, kind of challenged him, what do you need a grabber for, Alvin? And he just said, for grabbing, which is, to me, typical Midwestern response. as in, well, what do you think I'm using it for? And also the subliminal message is none of your business.
Right.
That's vintage kind of lines that both of our fathers might have said, both Mary and mine. I know it is for my dad.
Yeah.
My dad was like, well, what do you think? No lengthy explanation required. And again, as I said earlier, Mary and I found ourselves talking about our dads or thinking about our dads a lot as we did this screenplay. And I think Mary had lost her father by that time. I had not lost my dad. I just lost my dad in the last year at the age of 88.
Oh.
But both of them, had that Midwestern way of speaking and reasoning. And they were men from a different generation, which also contributes to it.
Well, I'm wondering then if the whole idea of Wisconsin as a party state is a younger generation, if that comes out of the 80s or the 90s, that somehow in western Iowa, Wisconsin is where you go to party.
Right. Okay. So I think the reasoning behind that, I know for me, I'm not so sure of Mary, but Madison is known as a party town. And it's we've both been exposed to people who didn't go to Madison, but all came to Madison for a weekend to party. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of root of that. Also, the truth is, I think Wisconsin has more taverns per capita than any state in the United States. And it consumes a whole lot of alcohol and beer. We're always in the top 5 for alcohol consumption. So we're also mindful of those roots. I mean, and I have friends who come from the West Coast or whatever and sit down and have dinner or go to a tavern with people, and they're pretty gobsmacked by how much folks consume here, which is both a very social thing, but not always a good thing.
Well, the area baseball team is called the Brewers for a reason, right?
Yeah, no question about it. Milwaukee is a brew town, and it's just part of the culture. Gemütlichkeit is what the Germans call it. Having a beer and being gregarious.
Nice. You mentioned you both drawing on your fathers for this movie, and age really does play in the story of Alvin Straight. And in fact, he has several conversations about being older, and he talks about how the worst part of being old is remembering when you're young.
Right.
Obviously, Alvin Straight was a lot older than you and Mary were when you wrote this. How did you approach the topic of age as you put this story together?
Well, that's a great question. And again, I don't want to. I can speak for myself. Mary and I both brought our own perspectives to the screenplay, and the screenplay is absolutely a melding of both of those. But I can tell you, for me, I was a history major at the University of Wisconsin. And at the time that we wrote the screenplay, I had a small television show that became kind of a little bit of a popular cult show on sports cable. And it was called The Sports Writers on TV. And it was 3 old sports writers and 1 young sports writer talking about the affairs of the day. And the old sports writers, who were in their 60s and 70s at that time, they'd light up a cigar and they would, talk about the affairs of the day in a totally, utterly unscripted fashion, to the point where they never acknowledged the camera. The camera would open on them talking and leave them for commercial breaks at the end of the show as they talked. They never really acknowledged the camera. And so the effect of that was eavesdropping on these older guys talking about the sporting news and much more, the affairs of the day. And I personally have always been respectful and fascinated by what my elders had to say. And so I brought that bias to the screenwriting, and I really feel Mary has that perspective as well. Honoring your, honestly, the older generations don't get a lot of love in movies either, contemporary cinema. And, but we both felt respect for our elders and what they had to offer and the experiences they had that we didn't have, like the Depression and like World War II.
there's a big confession. There's a discussion at a bar about World War II, about war
Hmm.
stories. How was that informed? Was Alvin Straight a military veteran? Did you hear that second or third hand, or was that given to a
No,
little?
we heard that firsthand from his children, and he was a certified sharpshooter. But we took creative license with the tale, and also it was informed by the experience that David Lynch's father had in World War II, which he had shared with Mary,
Hmm.
which was real poignant about him being a witness to his friends being killed being strafed and killed before his eyes.
Huh.
And so that was kind of an amalgam of several stories that we had, but we didn't have a lot of detail of Alvin's. We knew he's in the European theater, and he was there for the full run of the war.
Hmm.
He was a guy from rural America, and the guys who went into World War II who were farm boys knew how to shoot and knew how to fix equipment.
Interesting.
Stephen Ambrose talks about that in his book Citizen Soldier, where when the Americans landed at Normandy, they came ashore pretty quickly, and they didn't anticipate the problems they were going to have in the hedgerow country of France. And so their tanks would go over these hedgerows, and the underbellies of the tanks would be exposed, and the Germans would blow them up. And Ambrose told a story about how a bunch of farm kids, jerry-rigged big scoops on the front of the tanks from torn up parts of Jeeps and stuff that had been exploded. And that's how they broke out of the hedgerow country. It wasn't, a bunch of generals figuring it out. It was a bunch of farm boys, figuring it out themselves and then welding this stuff to the front of the American tanks. And that's the kind of ingenuity, that Alvin had as well.
Yeah, I'd heard that story, and it's interesting how his generation, that World War II generation, is almost gone now.
Yes, it is, sadly.
And in a way, you can watch that movie differently now than when it came out in 1999, because there were many more people of that generation happening at the time.
Right.
You know, Alvin is depicted as a very plain-spoken person, and some of the most memorable scenes, like the one with the hitchhiker, the pregnant hitchhiker that he has an encounter with, they're memorable because the conversation is not really on the nose. Like he doesn't really set out to improve her lot or to convince her to make the right decision, but somehow in a very indirect way, in a very plain-spoken way, he tells a story. It also happens when he talks to the twins. He tells a story about brotherhood that is actually instructive. And so what was it like to write those scenes and to think about this extraordinary man who didn't speak in a cliched way?
Right. So that's a great question. And we did not get a chance to interview Alvin Straight. So when Mary and I sat down to write the first draft, and we start out with the first scene, we laid out 80 scenes, right? And then you go back and you start writing the first scene. And we ran smack dab into the issue of what did Alvin Straight sound like? And we knew in broad terms what men from rural Midwestern America sounded like. But his experience was different than our father's experience. And so I have to really give Mary a tremendous amount of credit. She remembered a researcher who had done a book during the Depression about the language of horse traders. And horse traders, went from town to town buying and selling horses. And the book was a little bit about the vernacular that they used, but in describing that, you really described the language of that time. And so we found that, and we went over it, and that really opened the door for us, because he couldn't sound like a cowboy, right? He wasn't in the 1800s. He was in the early 1900s. But there's precious little data about how Americans spoke at that time. Maybe movies, but that's Hollywood. And again, what did rural America sound like? So thanks to Mary, we used that book as a way to kind of open the door to what Alvin might sound like. And then for me personally, my dad played minor league baseball in in the 50s. And if you know anything about baseball, you know that baseball players have a lot of time on their hands during the game, in the bullpen, traveling, and a lot of minor league ball players are country boys. And my dad's lingo and my dad's anecdotes and turn of a phrase were really informed by that experience. And I use some of his phrases now, and people just laugh like hell. And they go, "Where'd you hear that?" I said, "I heard it from my dad." And I think he heard it in, dugouts all around the Midwest playing, D-ball. So I think it was an amalgam of those two. And I do think this, you have to have an ear for other dialects and other generations of talking. And Wisconsin especially, we have a wonderful mishmash of nationalities and, urban and rural. Once again, you can't live in Wisconsin without being affected by the farm culture. So I think that informed us as well.
You didn't meet Alvin Straight, but were you on the
I
set?
talked to him on the phone once. That was it.
Okay. Were you on the set of the movie?
Yes, I was on the set, not for all of the shooting, but I would say at different parts of the shooting along the way.
I'm just thinking that Richard Farnsworth, who plays Alvin Straight, is so convincing that it's hard for me to imagine the real Alvin Straight. Like I can't imagine. I think it would be jarring for me as a fan of the movie to hear a recording with the actual Alvin Straight. And Richard Farnsworth, as I understand it, is a California guy. So are you aware of how he came into that role and how he really was able to embody that Midwestern way of being in the world?
Well, yes. First of all, Alvin was a horseman. He was a stuntman in countless Hollywood movies before he ever spoke a line on camera. He was in Spartacus. He was in The Treasure of Sierra Madre. Farnsworth was, yeah. Mm-hmm. And so he wrangled the horses, and he was a horseman in the movies. In fact, first of all, he was a lovely man, and as David Lynch said, no actor was meant to play a role more than Richard was to play Alvin Straight. It was a perfect casting, and there were other actors considered, and they had to really convince Richard to take the role because he had real health issues. He had cancer, and so he really questioned his ability to play the role or to physically be able to do it. But then David informed Richard that Alvin walked with two canes, and Richard said, "Well, I can do that." And then they created a special seat for him in the lawnmower that help him with his hips and such. But there was speculation that Richard already had a terminal diagnosis when he took the role for Alvin. I can't confirm that, but he did die shortly after, within a year of the film being released, I believe. Took his own life because he was end stage with cancer. But Alvin was a horseman. He was a man of rural America, and played a lot of roles like that in Westerns throughout his career. Worked with John Wayne, worked with John Ford, worked with, he was like a stunt double for Jimmy Stewart and Humphrey Bogart and all these different actors. So playing Alvin, I don't think was a stretch for Richard at all. It was a natural extension of the roles he had played in countless films.
Yeah, it's such a strong association. You've actually called Richard Alvin a couple times now. So
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for that. Yeah,
that's fine. I think that just underscores how wedded to that role Richard is.
No, there's no question about it. And he got an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor for that film, for just the dynamic we're talking about. That if there ever was someone who fit the part he played, it was Richard as Alvin.
I have a question about a couple of details of the movie that, like, reviewers nodded to. It's a very non-typical David Lynch movie, but it has a scene where a distraught woman has hit a deer,
Right.
and she's very upset at having hit several deer over the past 7 weeks. Is that a David Lynch scene, or is that something you and Mary came up with?
No, that was in the screenplay. And honestly, David shot the screenplay. I was amazed at how little, if anything, was changed. They dropped a couple scenes, but honestly, David left the screenplay pretty much untouched. And that scene was based upon a story we stumbled across about a woman in Wisconsin who hit 14 deer in 1 year in her car.
Wow.
So we just thought that was so Midwestern that we wanted to include it. And also, Rolf, we drove through Iowa. And if you know this, if you drive through rural America, you see a ton of dead deer, especially in the fall during the rut, where, these bucks are mindlessly chasing does. And, in the fall, I always say when we drive up to our cabin in northern Wisconsin, you could hopscotch your way to northern Wisconsin on deer carcasses on Highway 51 going north. There's just a lot of them. And also during deer hunting season, every third car has a dead deer strapped to it. So that whole culture of deer and deer hitting cars is completely true to the Midwest.
Yeah, I'm talking to you from rural Kansas, where I'm based when I'm not traveling. And
Yeah, right. Sure.
I literally saw 3 deer cross my property yesterday.
Yeah, and it was like, oh my God, where do you get a dead deer carcass? Well, the producers got a dead deer carcass by simply calling the state patrol and saying, hey, if you come across a buck in the next 48 hours, we'll take it.
Huh.
But by the way, people hit deer with their cars in rural Wisconsin and across America. And, if you hit a deer with your car in Wisconsin, you get to keep it. And that's 200 pounds of really good protein. I hit a deer with my car and went into a nearby tavern. Okay, true to our story. And I said, hey, you guys, I just hit a deer with my car. Anyone has a truck that I can take it in to the, local DNR or sheriff station? And the guy, like 5 guys jumped up and said, sure, if I get to keep it. And I said, yeah, go right ahead. And so, I literally didn't know what to do, but you have to tag a deer if you've hit it, and you need to record it for the car insurance. So there's a process. But, someone jumped up and said, yeah, I'll throw it in the back of my pickup truck. Can I keep it? And I said, sure. And then all the old timers on our lake told me I was a fool to give away the deer. But I didn't know how to dress it out. So you go.
I think one thing that some viewers, especially non-Midwestern viewers, might miss on first viewing the Straight story is that it cuts to Alvin eating the deer that he has.
Yes, right.
Without showing him taking the deer off the road and dressing it.
Right.
It cuts to him eating that self same deer. So
can I tell you that's the most natural thing in the world for a lot of people in rural Midwest America is to absolutely take that deer and dress it out and, enjoy it, eat it. So I think that was completely believable. Although the notion of him, he could have given away some of the deer or whatever might have happened, but for him to get some of it, the hindquarters or the back straps or whatever he might have wanted, that's not unbelievable.
Yeah. So it's funny that, some reviewers pinpointed that as David Lynchian weirdness, when in fact it's actually pretty standard issue Midwestern type stuff.
Yeah, it is. And I don't know, Ralph, if you remember, but he eats the deer in a graveyard of cement deer statues.
Yeah, yeah.
And if you're in the Midwest, cement lawn art is a big deal, and deer are amongst the most popular cement objects that people stick on their front lawns in rural America. So, and by the way, that scene came about because when we traveled that route, we saw all sorts of lawn ornament companies with all sorts of stuff, laid out there for people to buy and put in on their lawns, which was it was remarkable to us. So that's how that scene came about.
And so it was in the script.
I might add, David having the deer being consumed by Alvin surrounded by all deer, that was Dave's touch. I don't know that if we had that in the screenplay, but we did have this notion of these lawn ornaments being part of it.
Yeah, that's terrific and a memorable scene. Well, keeping in mind that you probably have to go to lunch pretty soon and have 10 beers like a good Wisconsinite.
Yeah. Hey, Ralph, can I just say one thing and perhaps end as we started? It was such first of all, this is the anniversary this next week, 20 years from when we debuted at the Cannes Film Festival. My wife and I flew to France and walked up the red carpet with David and Spacek and Richard and his wife and Harry Dean Stanton, who was a tremendous Hollywood actor who just passed, as well as Angelo Badalamenti and his wife. Angelo, the score of the film is remarkable. And, I'm very quick to say that I'm forever grateful to Mary for wanting to write a screenplay with me, forever grateful to David for seeing something in our screenplay, and including me in the posse at Cannes. And that's why I said I felt like I was called up to the bigs for a year, because it was, to me, it was like being called up to the majors and having your film reviewed by every newspaper in the world, and to be a part of. We were nominated for an Independent Spirit Award, so we were out in Hollywood for that. We were able to bring our kids to the Hollywood premiere. We were there for Academy Award weekend when Richard was up for Best Actor. And just to be a part of the world that David and Mary lived, to be a part of that for a year, and the echo of it throughout the rest of my life has been remarkable. And, we still have like a 96 or 97 on Rotten Tomatoes, and, get 4 and 5 star reviews on Amazon and IMDb. And I jokingly tell my friends, whenever I'm feeling depressed, I just go read the reviews on Amazon of the Straight story, and it makes me feel better.
Well, as I recall, Roger Ebert, the most famous critic of the era, really gushed over the film.
He did, and David and Roger didn't always see eye to eye on David's films. But, there's an aggregation of movie reviews at the end of the year, and we were in the top. I think we were the 4th top rated film of 1999. We were on the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Time Magazine, Movies of the Year. So that I was pinching myself through the whole experience, truthfully. And, my family, my brothers, my friends give me, crap because I'll invariably mention something about the Straight Story experience when I've had 3 beers. Not to be a name dropping thing, but it was just such a wonderful experience for me and my wife and family.
So after 20 years, does it feel any different? How is this a part of your life now?
Well, I always say the most, someone who has made his living in the arts, Rolf, the thing that you want to do, and the thing that they describe art about, is that art is a human being wanting to express that I existed. And, like the cave art in France. And for me, there's 2 real rewarding things about it. To have written a David Lynch film, a film that has gotten critical acclaim, that people seem to enjoy. And the notion that something I wrote, lines I wrote that were spoken by Alvin, or that I wrote along with Mary, that were spoken by Alvin Straight and the actress Sissy Spacek and all the people along the way, that people will watch that film long and study it, frankly, long after I'm dead and gone. That's incredibly satisfying to me.
This has been Deviate with Rolf Potts. More about everything that was just mentioned, including links to the Straight Story and the work of John Roach, can be found in the show notes at rolfpotts.com/deviate. And as always, you can contact me with insights or questions at deviate@rolfpotts.com. This episode was produced by Justin Glow. Cedar Van Tassel does the theme music. Jan Futterman does the show notes. Thanks for listening, and I hope you tune in for future episodes of Deviate with Rolf Potts.